positivity, and then there's other words maybe not so much. So when you see the word submit, what does that kind of evoke in you? All right, surrender. Do you see it as a positive thing, or is it kind of like, oof, submit? We're talking about submitting tonight. Yeah. I agree with that, and I think that is verified when you do go to Google Images and try to find images for your PowerPoint slide that fit the theme of submitting. It's all like things like that, and so I did find one picture, and I think that we kind of think about something like that when we think about submitting, right? Especially even in the church, where it's like I have authority, and I'm going to perform some sort of spiritual jujitsu on you and get you in a spiritual armbar, and you better tap out or else I'm going to break your arm, right? I think that's sometimes what we think of when we think of submission, but I hope that we can maybe think about it in a little different light when we kind of ponder it this evening, because I really believe that when we talk about submitting to one another, that this is like maybe one of the most important things that we've talked about so far in this series. I don't think that a church can really thrive as a cohesive unit without us following this one another, this command. And so this comes from Ephesians chapter 5. Of course, when we talk about submission, our English word, it's from the Latin submittere, but that's really two Latin words put together, which means to send under, right? And so, it kind of lends itself to this negative connotation. But in Ephesians 5 and verse 21, you come to this passage, and there's a series of instructions there, and that's where we're told to sing psalms, hymns, spiritual songs, and we're to give thanks always and for everything to God. But in verse 21, he says, submit to one another in the fear of Christ. And really, when you look up the Greek word, it means similar word to our English word. It means to arrange under. And so already we're kind of getting this, I think, negative connotation in our minds, because we're thinking of a hierarchical structure, and there's people at the top, and then there's people that are at the bottom. And if you're at the bottom, well, then too bad, right? And so in our society, if you have authority, then you have the power, right? You have the advantage over the other person. When we think about authority in our context, we think about that as something to leverage against somebody else. But when you look at the scriptures, I think that what you're going to find is that every person, and I do think there are positions of authority kind of outlined in scripture. I do think there's times where there is a hierarchical structure, but every position of authority in the scriptures has a flip side to it. And what you find when you kind of piece everything together and all these different relationships that we have within a church is that everybody is submitting to somebody in some way. Even if the word submit is not used specifically of that person in their role, maybe it's an elder, I think you can find passages that lend itself to the idea that, no, this person is also supposed to submit. And so Paul could go to the extent to say, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. So he doesn't put limitations on it. His command to the church in Ephesus is everybody's supposed to submit to everybody. And so this is where I say this is actually a really positive word, and let's work hard to kind of get the negative connotations out of our mind, because it has been abuse in the world. And so I think when we have this negative connotation built up around the word submit, that doesn't do us any favors when we go to like Ephesians, the next passage. Ephesians 5 and verse 22 that says, wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. And there's people that have such a problem with that idea that they kind of try to play, they become like spiritual ninjas or something like that, and they look at the scriptures and they try to rearrange it and kind of develop a more egalitarian view. But when you put it together with other passages, they're saying the same thing. And so you can look at the other passages in Colossians 3 and verse 18, 1 Peter 3:1, Titus 2:5. There's other passages as well that kind of allude to this idea. And it's just clear that there is this headship that a man has in a marriage relationship, and that Paul is telling wives to submit to their husbands. And, I realize we have a problem with that, but I'm tempted to say that we just have a problem sometimes with the idea of submission as a whole. But as Christians, whether you're a complementarian, which I think that's what most of us would identify as far as when we read the Bible, or whether you're egalitarian, both of those people on either side of the aisle, we all agree that we're supposed to submit to Jesus. And so I don't think our problem is just submitting, in general. I think for whatever reason, we all are able to agree that we're supposed to submit to Christ. And so I guess my question is, why is it that we're comfortable with that idea? Why are we comfortable with the idea of submitting to Christ? And all Christians are just ready to accept that as a fact. We're willing to acknowledge that Jesus is head and that the church submits to him, he's king, while other concepts of submission seem offensive. And so I'm not just talking about the husband-wife relationship, but what about during COVID? I think that some people found it offensive that we're to obey government and be subject to the governing authorities. There's people that are offended by that idea, but we are very comfortable with the idea of submitting to Christ. And so that's a long question. But why are we comfortable with this idea of submitting to Christ and not so comfortable with the idea of submitting to other entities or people? Pride, okay. Yes. Yeah, that's a big one, right? Go ahead, David. Yeah, it's more of a in-your-face type of submission. And sometimes what we can do is just make Jesus whoever we would like him to be. And really we're getting the scriptures and Jesus to submit to us and not so much the other way around. And so I think that's totally correct. I think Abby said something and that's really what I was looking for. Jesus is perfect. And more specifically, we have a confidence in Jesus that he is seeking our best interests, that he's devoted to our needs. And I started this off by saying there's a flip side to every relationship, even if somebody has authority over me. And I think that's true even in our relationship with Jesus. He has authority over us, but isn't there a flip side to this as well, and as far as this idea of submission? Is there any way in which Jesus submitted to us, his church? Any sense? Yeah. So what Jesus and what God is asking is for us to give up our authority over ourselves, right? The right to call our own shots. And he's asking us to kind of lay our crowns at his feet. But Jesus, he also gave up his authority, didn't he? He didn't really give it up to us. He gave it up to the Father. But he certainly gave it up for us. And so, yeah, Jesus has authority over his church, but there's a flip side to that, where he submitted to our needs is what he did. And so therefore, we submit to his authority. And so I think for that reason, we're really comfortable with this idea of submitting to Christ. And I think the reason we're not so comfortable submitting to other entities or people is because sometimes they don't have our best interests in mind. Sometimes that person isn't really devoted to what I need. Sometimes that person isn't trying to help me. Sometimes they are trying to hurt me and abuse me. And so that's why I say there's a flip side to every relationship. And so in the husband-wife relationship, this verse has been quoted, right, to abuse wives for centuries, right? That you're supposed to submit to me, but there's more to that story. What's the flip side when it comes to submission within the husband-wife relationship? Okay. All right. Yeah, absolutely. And then, David, what were you saying?
Well, the language is that he gave himself up for the church. That's a good definition of submission.
Right. So is there a sense in which a husband submits to his wife? That's kind of awkward to say, but I think it's consistent when you look at the scriptures. And so Ephesians 5 and verse 25. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. I like what David said, that is really a pretty good description of what submission is. You're giving up yourself, right? You're taking up your cross and following Jesus. What is that but giving yourself up, right? For something else, for a greater cause, to follow the Lord. And so, yeah, wives submit to husbands, but that's bearing in mind that the husbands are devoted to the best interests of their wives. And they are giving themselves up right? They're giving up their own self-interests for the interests of their wife and for their family. So there's a flip side in the marriage relationship. In every relationship, that's true. Anybody else have comments on that or something they wanted to add? Go ahead, David.
I think it's the idea of submission being giving up one's autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
The wife gives up her autonomy to submit to her husband. The husband has to give up his autonomy for the benefit of the wife.
Right.
It may take different forms, but it's submission.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's a mutual submission is what it is. And so I said there's other scriptures that I think bear this out. So husbands in 1 Peter 3 and verse 7, in the same way, live with your wives in an understanding way. So in other words, just because you have authority doesn't mean you're able to treat that person however you want. He says, do it as with a weaker partner, showing them honor as co-heirs of the grace of life. And so already you're getting a different picture of this authority, submission, headship relationship, where in the world, if somebody has authority, you show honor to the person who has authority. But in this context, while that might be true, the wife, I think, is to show honor to the husband, it's also true that the husband is to show honor to his wife. And so there's a flip side there. And then Colossians 3 and verse 19, husbands, love your wives. Do not be harsh with them. So don't be, an abusive leader, right? 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 4, for the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. And that's, we know specifically, I think, talking about the intimate physical relationship between a husband and wife. And Paul's saying that, listen, the wife has authority. If she has needs, she has authority over the husband's body, and likewise, the husband over the wife's body. So you have this mutual submission that's taking place. And so it's not as simple as just quoting a verse saying, I'm the head and you gotta obey me. Although sometimes we would like to play that game. That's not the case. So what about submission and parenting? So the obvious verse that we have here in front of us is Colossians 3, and he also talks about this in Ephesians. Basically says the same thing. But children, obey your parents in everything. Pretty cut and dry, right? So how many things are children supposed to obey their parents in? How many things? Everything, right? Everything. So, sorry guys. But for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not exasperate your children so that they won't become discouraged. And so we know, obviously, that apparently there's children in the audience when these letters are delivered. And so Paul in Colossians and Ephesians, it's going over this idea of the different roles and people that are who they're supposed to submit to, a husband-wife relationship, and it's as if he's saying, okay, you children, hey, you guys listen up. You're supposed to submit to your parents. But this is also another one that probably has been abused in households, isn't it? Where you maybe have an authoritarian, military-style parents that are just like running their home like they're drill sergeants or something like that. You can imagine how these passages can become very abusive. Is there a flip side to the parenting relationship? Is there a sense in which parents submit to their children? In what way? Okay. All right. Yeah. I would definitely say not beating them is up there, right? Yeah, for sure. And what were you saying, Dan? A sacrifice. So it's the same thing as with a husband and a wife. I think that parents, kids are supposed to submit to their parents, but meanwhile, parents are to have their kids' best interests in mind. In fact, there's a responsibility there. And as a parent, you're submitting to the needs of your children. And so here, fathers, they're parenting in a way that isn't exasperating their children to the point that they become discouraged. And so you discipline them, you guide them, you lead them, but you do it keeping their needs in mind, not just, our own needs. Go ahead, Janice. Oh, who wants to define that word for me? I mean, I think just to kind of, I don't know. That's a good question. How would you define that, David? Yeah. In Ephesians, it talks about provoking your children to anger. I think that's kind of the idea, is to stir them up, to provoke them, to kind of stretch them emotionally. I think that's kind of the idea here. Yeah, yeah. Just pushing them beyond their limits, right? Expecting too much, being on their case over every little thing. Again, not thinking about them and how we're impacting them emotionally, but purely thinking about ourselves, I guess. That's a good question, though. I should look up the Greek next time. Anybody else? Yeah, and so in Ephesians 6 and verse 4, fathers, don't stir up anger in your children. So I think he's basically making the same point there, right? But bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. And so for a parent here, for specifically fathers, they're submitting to the spiritual needs of the child. That this child doesn't exist just for me and to do what I want them to do, but they exist so that I can raise them up to eventually glorify and serve God. And so again, there's a flip side there. What about submission and elders? So there's some people that read this passage as an example, right? Obey your leaders, submit to them, since they keep watch over your souls as those who will give an account, and so that they can do this with joy and not with grief, for that would be unprofitable for you. And so if you're not careful, you get to a position where you're serving as an elder. It's very easy to look at the sheep like they exist for you, right? And that is the word that's used to describe the elder position. It's a shepherd. And it talks about us, the members of the church, as being a flock of sheep. And so just kind of picture that for a moment. You got a shepherd out there, and how many shepherds are walking amongst their sheep and are yelling at them, submit to me, sheep, getting on their case, right? And kind of going on a power trip because I'm the shepherd and I got the shepherd's crook, and all these shepherds or all these sheep have to obey what I'm doing, right? That's silly, right? That idea is silly. In fact, if you try to drive sheep like cattle, they're all going to run away from you. A sheep has to be very comfortable with the shepherd. Jesus talks about how the sheep, they hear and they know my voice. In those days, you could have two groups of sheep intermingling, and these shepherds had their own specific calls, and the sheep, would hear one shepherd's call, and that shepherd's sheep, they would perk their ears up and they would pay attention because they all know the shepherd's voice. That's what Jesus is alluding to there. And so they're familiar with their sheep. They're spending time with their sheep. But I've heard this passage, and it is true, I have to add, that we are supposed to submit to our elders, that they are there to make decisions, particularly in areas of judgment. We know that if it's not an area of judgment, who is our obligation to ultimately? Who are we faithful to? God, right? So they're there to help make decisions and to point the church in the right direction and kind of keep the sheep together, right? And so we are to submit to them and honor them and respect their decisions. But I've also heard this passage quoted from an elder to a member that's disagreeing with them and kind of in an ominous tone saying, basically, you got to submit to me, and if you don't, that would be unprofitable for you, right? You're going to go to hell if you don't listen to me. It's almost the overtones that I've actually seen that. And that's really unhealthy because it is true that as members, we submit to the elders, but is there also a flip side to the elder-church relationship? Is there a flip side to it? Is there any sense in which the elders submit to a church? Yeah. Yeah. So just think about a shepherd for a moment, right? So if a shepherd is with his sheep, he's out there by himself, just him and the sheep, shepherd gets thirsty, does he go to the sheep and demand the sheep to go get him a drink? Is that how that works? No, not really, right? What about when a wolf comes? Does a shepherd hide behind the sheep and send the sheep out of the sheep pen to defend him? Is that how it works? Better not. What about when he injures himself? We read about passages where the sheep comes and throws the shepherd over his shoulder and delivers the shepherd to safety. No, it's the other way around. The shepherd goes after the sheep, throws him over his shoulders, and guides the sheep to safety. I think the best example, there's a lot of examples, right? Jesus, the good shepherd, right? In John 10. That's a great passage on what it means to be a shepherd. But what about Psalm 23? That's what this is all about. The Lord is my shepherd. And I know there's things here that obviously are only going to apply to God, but when it comes to shepherding, and not just as an elder, but I think just leaders in general, I think these are principles that we ought to live by because This is how God shepherds. And I want to do everything like God does if I'm able to. He says, the Lord is my shepherd. I have what I need. He lets me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. So it's the shepherd guiding the sheep, right? He leads me beside quiet waters. He renews my life. He leads me along the right paths. Even when I go through the darkest valley, I fear no danger, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. So his rod and staff aren't there to, break the sheep's neck. That when the shepherd has to use his shepherd's crook, the result in the end is that it comforts the sheep. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. It's amazing that David describes God as like this shepherd that's taking care of all his needs, that's serving him, the sheep, to the point where he has no need, has no wants. And yet God has all authority. And this is something that David recognized in God. And so I think that's our example for leadership. When we talk about shepherds shepherding a church, it's look at all the things God is doing in this passage. He's leading, right? He's leading to quiet waters. He's leading to right paths. He's comforting. He's preparing this table in the presence of his enemies. He's anointing his head with oil. Sheep in those days, they would get bugs in their eyes a lot of times, right? And their kind of wool would grow over their eyes. And so it kept pest off of them when you would anoint their head with oil. That would kind of keep them clean of pesticides and other things that could get into their eyes or give them possible infections. But David is saying, look, this is what God does for me. He looks at the shepherd-sheep relationship, and he sees that in his relationship with God. And it's really a beautiful image. And so this is the model. It's not, we don't look at business to get our model of how a church should operate, right? We don't look at the military as a model for how the church should operate. I think we look to God. And he gives this metaphor constantly of a shepherd shepherding his sheep. Any thoughts on that before I move my next slide? Go ahead.
Passage that has really impacted my thinking on this topic is Ezekiel 34.
Yeah.
Where the prophet is addressing the shepherd's mission.
Mm-hmm.
The prophet's leadership last. And of course, in that context, he's using negative language. These guys were not doing it right.
Yeah.
Instead of right, here's
They were feeding themselves and, yeah.
basically, that they were not seeking the lost, they were not healing the sick, they were not taking care of this and that, but instead, you were ruling them partially.
Yeah.
They were just doing everything wrong, but yet it is, that description he gives, unfortunately, describes a lot of elderships.
Yeah, it does. And I will say, I have to say this, I think we all can agree, it doesn't describe this eldership. Let's be clear about that. But I think it's important to talk about because the future of a church sometimes stands or falls depending on the eldership and the people we choose and pick out from amongst us to lead us. And if you have somebody in there that's like a bull in a china shop, obviously, it could wreck a church. And so if we're thinking about one day this idea, maybe there's some men out here, some young men, maybe some people that are closer to this point than others, but if you're thinking you would like to be an elder one day, I think it's really important that we understand that this is something that comes with authority, but it's also a responsibility, and it's really more about serving than it is about power and authority. So look at 1 Timothy 3. This is where you got elder qualifications, right? And it talks about how an elder must manage his own household competently and have his children under control with all dignity. That's kind of a tough verse, right? Because you have the word manage in there, which in the Greek really just means to like rule, like he's in charge, right? And so I don't think the idea here is like what Sound of Music, you blow the whistle and here are all your 7 kids and they're lined up there and he keeps a tight budget and I don't think that's what Paul has in mind. Maybe that's part of it, but I don't think that's primarily what Paul has in mind. He goes on to, I think, to explain what he means by this and why this is important. He says, if anyone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he take care of God's church? And so you look at a guy's and his family, in how he relates to his family, and that should be an indication of what he would potentially do in the role of serving as an elder. How does a man kind of relate and interact with his family? Is he there as a drill sergeant? If that's what he is with his family, there's a good chance that's what he's going to be as an elder. That's not what Paul's talking about. When he talks about managing, he's talking about somebody that takes care of his family, addresses their needs, has their best interests in mind. Really, that guy we read about in Ephesians 5. He's giving himself up for his wife, for his family. So that word take care of, it's the same word in Luke 10. So turn over to Luke 10 so you get an idea here. It's only used 3 times. And so the 2 other times are in verse 34 and then verse 35. Sorry, I'm kind of slow here. Luke 10 and verse 34 through 35. So this is obviously the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? So you have all these guys that pass by this other man that's been beaten and left for dead, and we know what the Samaritan did and what makes him so good, right? It says in verse 34, he went over to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on olive oil and wine. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, take care of him. When I come back, I'll reimburse you for whatever extra you spend. So this is the same word Paul uses in 1 Timothy 3, verse 4 through 5. And it's really used to describe what an elder's role is in the church, is to take care of God's church. The way that Good Samaritan took care of that poor guy that was beaten and left for dead. What extent did he go to take care of that guy? I mean, he gave of his means. Maybe it interrupted his trip. He had to go out of his way. He took the time to bandage him and get his hands dirty and the blood and everything else that this guy would have been dealing with as he's lying there dead. But he was doing it to take care of him. He was doing it because it was the right thing. And that's really what the role is of an elder. His role is to take care of God's church, to bandage the spiritually wounded, right? To encourage people when they're downcast, to help us get to our destination, right? Help us get to heaven is really what the idea here is. And so 1 Peter 5, verse 2 through 3, there's that word again. He's talking to elders. He says shepherd, right? Of all the words he could use, right? Shepherd. Shepherd God's flock among you, not overseeing out of compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you. Not out of greed for money, but eagerly. Not lording it over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. So this is the flip side, right? The church, by all means, submits to the elders. But it's the same concept as a wife submitting to a husband. When we have elders that are quoting these verses to get people to fall in line with what they want them to do, I don't see any difference between that and a husband quoting Ephesians 5 to his wife, trying to get her to submit to him. It's the same thing. And so one of the verses that has stuck out to me, there's this book, I meant to bring it in here to show you the cover. It was written by a professor at Abilene University, and I think he preached for a while. So he's, used to the same church structure that we are, plurality of elders and all that. But he wrote a book called They Smell Like Sheep. And it sounds like a weird title, but the reason it's called that is because if you have a shepherd, what's a shepherd going to smell like if he's doing a shepherding job? They smell like sheep because he's walking amongst the sheep. He's touching the sheep. He's involved with the sheep, right? He's spending every waking moment with the sheep. And so his point is that shepherds, elders, should smell like sheep. They should be amongst the members. Sometimes elderships are like, kind of like the Illuminati, like we think they're out there, but we're not really totally sure. They're like the shadow group, and every once in a while I think they're kind of controlling things from behind the scenes. And all you know is you're kind of uncomfortable and scared when they walk up to you, right? You're saying that's not how it should be. They should be in and amongst the members, involved with their lives to the point where they can take care of their wounds. They should smell like sheep. And so in that book, he goes over the different kinds of models you see in churches as far as leadership models, and he gives negative examples. He talks about one, he describes it as the sheriff elder. And so the sheriff elder is the guy who kind of, busts into the church building like he would into a saloon, not a salon, right? yeah, weird cowboy. But and the first thing he does when he walks in the room, what does the sheriff do? Here's my badge. Here it is. Okay, I'm a sheriff. I'm the sheriff, right? They're shepherds that, okay, they don't have a shepherd badge, but they walk into a room and they want to assert themselves as being the one that has authority in the room. And so it can be a position that appeals to pride. That's why it's really important to have good men there. But he put this quote in there, and it's always stuck with me since I read it a few years ago. He says, if you have to assert your authority, you don't have much. That's the truth. If you're at the point where you're having to say to somebody, look, do you respect my authority or not? Like, you've already lost them. And so when we talk about elders having authority, where does their authority really lie, do you think? Where does their influence over a congregation really lie? What do you think? Okay. Yeah, so they're with people, they're interacting with them. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's hitting the nail on the head. It's being an example. It's showing somebody what it looks like to, serve Christ. And when we're doing that, when we really have a heart for God's people and we really care about them, and we're in it for them more than we're in it for us, I mean, I think that we experience it in our jobs. You know when you have a boss that is going to go to bat for his employees. And what are you willing to do for that boss? What lengths are you willing to go to for that boss? You're going to do everything he asks you and then more, and you're going to do it with a smile on your face. It's the same thing with elders, that when the sheep know the elder, the shepherd, has their best interests in mind, the elder has their back, that he's not in it for himself, but he's giving himself up for us, that's where the true influence of an elder really lies, at least. That's what I see in Scripture, at least. Larry, you had your hand up? Yeah. Yeah. Yep. We see it in sports with coaches, right? I mean, I had coaches that just did not care about the players. And you know what? Those teams weren't very good, and we didn't have fun playing either. It was the coaches that, really had our best interests in mind, and, those were the ones that you wanted to play for. Those were the times that you had fun. And so, 1 Peter 5 and verse 5. Here's the flip side that I also have to mention. So there's other passages where we're told to submit to like government and things like that, slaves to masters. I don't want to talk about that. I want to focus more on the passages that relate to submitting to one another. And so this is one of the last ones. I have this one and one more. But he specifically brings up young people. He says, in the same way, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. And I guess I'm curious to hear from you guys, why does he specifically give that instruction to younger people? Obviously, that applies to all of us, but why does he bring up specifically younger people here? It's almost like a trap question because we don't want to be bashing our young people, right? And so I won't bash, but I will say that as young people understand that there's a temptation to dismiss our elders and to kind of assume that they don't know as much as I know. And so what I would say is just do your best not to give into that and be countercultural. Don't be like your friends. Don't be with like the society around you when they kind of look at older people and people in positions of authorities and say, they don't know what they're talking about. I think they had that problem back then. These people that Peter's writing to, and he says that they are to be subject to their elders. And so there's some people that think Peter has in mind more than just the eldership here, but in general, people who are older. I don't know about that, but it's worth thinking about. But then he goes on to say, all of you, clothe yourselves with humility toward one another. There's another one, another passage. Because God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And so I've always been kind of curious about this passage, right? He doesn't just say, be humble towards each other, but he says be clothed with humility. Why do you think Peter chooses this metaphor to be like clothed with humility? Like he pictures humility as something that you put on and you wear. Why that metaphor? Okay. Yeah, that's true.
Well, we also, when we are humble, we take a minute to listen to our elders and take their advice and take what they say with wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to be subjected to that so that we can lead a better life
Right. So yeah,
that is humble
yeah.
and serving others.
So submission, when it comes to submission, humility is absolutely key. It's almost like those two things go hand in hand. You can't have submission without humility. But I just find it interesting, he talks about it like a clothing. So it's almost, I've wondered if his point is to say, this is something that if you don't have it, what are you? You're naked. You're naked without it. And how many of us would assemble with a group of Christians without our clothing on? Right? I hope none. And I wonder if that's what he's trying to get across here. All of you be clothed with humility. The point is, if you don't have this, you're naked, and you ought to feel ashamed. It really is what it comes down to, because that means that we have pride. And so this is something that I think Peter looks at as being absolutely essential for every person in the body of Christ. He says, all of you clothe yourselves with humility towards one another. So notice he, in the context of talking about elders, he just got done telling young people submit to elders. He now says, all of you be clothed with humility. So this involves every single person within God's body. Last one that I want to look at, he says, this is a different passage, 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 15. He says, brothers and sisters, you know the household of Stephanas. They are the first fruits of Achaia and have devoted themselves to serving the saints. So whoever these people are, they were recognized by Paul for serving, for submitting to the needs of their brothers and sisters and going out of their way to do so. They were giving themselves up for the saints. And so Paul in turn says, I urge you also to submit to such people. Isn't that interesting? That you have these guys that were there and they were serving the saints, and Paul is saying, you submit to those who are serving. And he says, and to everyone who works and labors with them. So what does that mean? What does that look like to have people submitting to servants? What does that mean here? I don't think we're talking about a power structure here. What does Paul mean when he says to submit to those guys?
This translation says they devote themselves to the service of the saints, or you put yourself in the service of such.
Wow, yeah, that's good. Yeah,
So it's a mutual service.
that's perfect. And that's RSV, isn't it? New RSV. That's exactly it. The idea here, I think, is that there's something about what these guys were doing that was productive, and so as a response, the brethren there were to help those guys provide whatever they need. That's the idea. And so notice everybody's submitting to each other. And that's why I say this is actually a beautiful word. It's not one we should look at with negative connotations, but when you look at the scriptures, this is like, the heartbeat of what makes a congregation go, right, as far as attitudes go. And so I just want to finish up by going over a few practical applications. When you talk about submission, I think it really starts with leadership. When you talk about having a culture of submission, it starts with leaders. And so imagine or think about Jesus washing feet, right? He was giving this model of them for them to serve each other and submit to each other, but it started with him. He set the example, didn't he? And so that's what we're supposed to do. And so imagine in the first century a scenario where you have people coming to church, and it wasn't totally unusual to have people wash somebody's feet. They were wearing sandals and they were on a long journey, and so they get inside to wherever it is they're meeting, maybe somebody's house, and whose responsibility do you think it was to get the water, and if it was appropriate for the occasion, to get down on their knees and wash somebody's feet? Who was it that should be doing that first? What's that? Okay. But I'm saying in the context of a first century church, though, you're right. Yeah. Yeah, leadership, right? Isn't that a weird, wonky image that you have the elders? You know, if anybody, if they're going to do that, it would be the elders, ideally, that are getting down and washing the feet of the saints. And so, submission, a culture of submission, that's what Jesus did. He was Lord. He was King. He had all authority, and he's the one that got down on his knees to wash our feet. And so we ought to imitate that attitude as well. Authority in the kingdom, it's not something to leverage over somebody else, but authority in the kingdom, whether we're talking about a man with his wife, elders with the church, it's a greater opportunity and responsibility to serve. And so that's true of husbands, parents, and elders. It's not this power struggle, but it is this opportunity and really a responsibility to serve the people that we have charge over. And then lastly, we should remember that kingdom submission is actually a wonderful thing because, again, when you picture this, I mean, you're just naturally going to have a cohesive unit. Not to say that there's going to be no problems that come up, but if you have everybody in every role looking at somebody, and this is somebody that I need to submit to, whether I'm submitting to their authority or whether I'm submitting to their needs, aren't you naturally going to end up with a wonderful church? I mean, that's just what's going to happen. And so if we're looking at our lives and are hoping maybe one day to be husband, maybe one day to be parents, maybe one day to serve in a church as elders, let's keep in mind what those roles really mean for us, that those are positions where we are to serve these people that perhaps we have a leadership role over. And so that's kind of, to me, this biblical idea of submission. Anybody else have any comments or thoughts? Go ahead, Janice. Yeah.
Isn't that another definition of what love is? That we are to love one another enough to be able to get on hands and knees down and give them other people what they need?
Yeah, I think it is, because agape love is you're putting this other person's interests ahead of your own. And I think that's really at the heart of submission as well, isn't it? Yeah, good point. Anybody else? All right, that's all I got. I think David's going to finish up for us next week, so it's probably going to be the best class so far. But thank you.